So I want to discuss the end of human rights. And what I mean by human rights are human rights as prescribed in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. That's what I intend by human rights, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. So the pinnacle of human rights are actually the rules of war. Because if you're going to treat your enemies in a certain way, then that is predicated upon the notion that in spite of the fact that they're your enemies, they still have these rights. And typically, if you treat your enemies in a certain way, you're not going to treat your citizens and whatnot in a worse way. So if you don't kill the women and children of your enemy, you're not going to then go and kill the women and children of your society. If you're not going to enslave the women and children of your enemy, you're not going to enslave the women and children of your society, right? I think that's sensible, but also there's a flip there, and that is that if you are going to enslave the women and children of your enemy, it doesn't then follow that you will do the same to your own people, right? And that's an important thing to bear in mind. Now, when I say you wouldn't do something to your enemy, I'm not talking about you wouldn't do it because it's not pragmatic. I mean, you wouldn't do it because you feel it's wrong. So you have a moral aversion to it. That's what I'm talking about. Where we're talking about situations where you don't really think it's wrong, but you're not doing it because of some pragmatic reason, that's not the same. That's a very different circumstance, and that does happen, by the way. And a good example of this would be Abdullah Yusuf Azzam. Abdullah Yusuf Azzam is one of the big influences on Osama bin Laden, and this guy, he has this ruling regarding the war in Afghanistan, which he was part of against the Soviets. And he makes the argument that, well, you shouldn't enslave the women and children of the Russians, because if you do that, they'll come and enslave our women and children. So the argument he's making is not saying that enslaving your enemy is wrong. He's saying, well, they'll just enslave us and they have more power, so we're kind of screwed. That's why we shouldn't do it. And that's very different from, someone saying, well, we're not going to enslave the women and children because it's wrong. And obviously, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam is fundamentally flawed in his reasoning, because one of the problems is he assumes that the reason the Russians were enslaving Muslim women was because the Muslims were enslaving Russian women, and not because the Russians just felt it was wrong. Typically, if someone feels something is really wrong, you doing the same thing's not going to make them think it's right. For example, if I think it's wrong to rape women, and you come and you rape my daughter, I'm not going to then go and rape your daughter and say, well, he raped my daughter, I'm going to rape his daughter. No, how does that make sense? I think it's wrong to rape women. So do bear that in mind, that not everyone who upholds certain rules of war does that because they believe in it. In some cases, they are compelled to do it. And one of the things, even in societies that by and large believe in these rules, it's not the case that everyone believes in them. It's not the case that everyone believes in these human rights. There's always going to be people who disagree. So in the world, we have these losers and we have these winners. These people who win, their societies dominate, and other peoples whose societies and civilizations crumble. And Western or European civilization has been on the ascendancy for a few hundred years. Before that, there were other civilizations which were on the ascendancy, and whenever these civilizations are on the ascendancy, they tend to impose their values and whatnot, right? So we in the West, what's happened is the West has tried its utmost to impose its understanding of human rights. Now, one of the fun things that happened because of that was you had a bunch of people who were colonized and whatnot, and these people don't necessarily believe in the human rights of the West, but they sit down and they say, hey, you're telling us about these human rights, and you're calling us barbarians and whatnot, but look at all the horrible things you did to us. Ain't that horrible? And we see this a lot in the descendants of colonized people who are now citizens in the West. They feel that, there's this Western hypocrisy, and these guys are talking about human rights and whatnot, and look at all the crap they did. And I'm not saying that these people in the West, at least these descendants of oh gosh, these descendants of these colonized people don't believe in human rights. Some of them don't, some of them do. But I'm just making the point that if we go back to the colonial period, the people who were being colonized tended not to have these human right beliefs. They had different human rights beliefs, but they didn't have the ones we understand today. And in the world, we even today we have winners and losers. We have societies that are losing. So Palestine is a good example of this. This is a losing society. It's a losing civilization. And when you look at Palestinian propaganda, they always talk about human rights. They say this is a genocide, this is a Holocaust, this is that, this is the Israeli regime are like Nazis, and it's like hold on a second. But the Palestinians are very important, is because I believe the issue of Palestine is what will ruin human rights in the world. And let me go back and let me explain why. So let's go back in time. We're running back in time. We have this guy, Osama bin Laden, and Osama is influenced by Abdullah Yusuf Azam, who Abdullah Yusuf Azam is a Palestinian, funnily enough, but he's influenced by this guy, and he's upset about the West. He's upset about America's support for dictators. He's upset about America's support for Israel, and he feels victimized by this. He feels that the Americans are doing something wrong. And if you listen to Osama will employ humanist language. He will talk about how the Palestinians' rights, blah 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 blah. But if you think about it deeply, and you really think about what Islam preaches, you will come to the conclusion that Islam is not compatible with human rights as defined by the UN. You have to come to that conclusion. So why is this guy upset about the West treating him or Muslims or Arabs in a way that's better than how Islam or Muslims would treat non-Muslims? What's this about, right? Real answer there is Osama doesn't actually care about human rights, and a lot of the Islamists don't really care about human rights. They understand that it's a useful tool. They talk about this to sow divides in Western civilization. They talk about this to gain sympathy and whatnot, and it's a propaganda tool. It's not something they genuinely believe in. So what ends up happening is you end up with this situation where Osama and his crew manage to get 2 planes to go into the Twin Towers. And some people say, no, that's not true. It didn't happen like that. Actually, it was the CIA. Actually, it was Mossad. Actually, this, they can say that. But we do know that many Muslims throughout the Islamic world celebrated these attacks. And some of them were terrified of what was going to come. But by and large, the world stood with America. And when Bush said, you're either with us or you're against us, he had pretty much everyone with him. The Russians were with the Americans, right? They used Russian bases to wage that war on terror and whatnot. But the key I want to point out here is the attack on the Twin Towers was a violation of human rights. It was a war crime by all measures, right? And yet a lot of the people who have grievances against the West would try to whitewash the attack. They say, well, actually, the West kind of deserves it. They deserve it because they did this, and they dropped a nuclear bomb once upon a time, and right? So it was very interesting, and some just alright celebrate it. But after that, what you end up with is America invading Afghanistan, and America goes in and they have a little war which they ran very badly, and they try nation building, and then the Americans do something crazy. They go and invade Iraq, and there was good reasons to invade Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction was not true, and it was not the reason they should have gone with, but that's the reason they went with, and it was an illegal war by international law, and it created a problem. Now you can argue that there was a precedent for illegal wars. The bombing of Serbia during the Bosnian genocide was an illegal war by international law. It was the UN has this whole thing that it was illegal but justifiable. Okay. But I think that by the Americans arguing that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction when he didn't, they couldn't even use that argument after. So the Americans go into Iraq, they try nation building there, and a lot of people now have a lot more grievances with the Americans. And you have to remember that not everyone believes in, these human rights and Western values and whatever. Not even in the West, not everyone believes in it. But the adversaries of the West will now use the violations of America and even cases where the American soldiers go a bit too far, and they will use this in a propaganda campaign against the Americans. And there's a clear logic why Russia, China, and certain Islamic powers will do this. Because, if America's their adversary, weakening America is worthwhile. You don't have to believe in human rights to demoralize the American population. You don't have to believe in human rights to demoralize Western society. You don't need to believe in these things to use this as a tool to polarize the societies. You don't have to believe in this to use it in a way that you can recruit useful idiots, right? You don't need that. So that's what they go and do. I mean, and they won, right? They won. They absolutely won. America failed the propaganda war. The vast majority of people, even in the West, the vast majority I come across, from the civilian population, not higher ups. Higher ups have a very different way of looking at things, but the civilian populations, they are not happy about those wars. They think the wars were a disaster, right? The fact that the West failed not only to convince the rest of the world, but to convince their own populations is crazy, right? It's absolutely crazy. So the West loses this propaganda war, and that's not good. It's not good for the West, at least, but it's also not good for human rights. And there's a reason for that, because the adversaries don't believe in these human rights. So if they win, it's not a good thing. And by the way, I don't believe that the West, not the West, the adversaries of the West winning a propaganda war means that they're winning, on the ground. Those are two separate things. But now let's continue with our story of what happened in the world. You have these things, and obviously you always have Palestine and Israel fighting occasionally, and the Palestinians do something, the Israelis do something, the Palestinians say, oh, woe is us, where are human rights? And the world gets upset, and then there's a ceasefire, and they do it again every year, right? So that's one thing that's always happening in the background. That's just constantly happening. And you then also have this invasion by Russia of Ukraine, and this is a war of aggression. And if you're a fan of Russia, you say, oh, hold on a second, you're against our invasion of Ukraine. What about your invasion of Iraq? What about that? I mean, how can you condemn us? You're hypocrites, right? I mean, and I can understand why someone who is in Russia or a support of Russia would say that, but the fact that people in the West are saying that is crazy, right? But this is a key point here. If someone genuinely believed in human rights or the rules of war or international law and whatnot, you wouldn't say Russia invading Ukraine is okay because America also broke international law. You would say America was wrong, Russia was wrong. They were both wrong. And if you're just purely pragmatic about this, you would prefer a situation where there's one player who's breaking the rules and not two players breaking the rules, because now you're getting more of the rules broken. You're getting more people subjugated to this. It's better that just one person is acting crazy than two people, right? I mean, just if you genuinely believe in this stuff. So the fact that the global south, as people like to call it, don't really condemn Russia, they don't really care too much, shows that they don't really believe in this human rights. They don't really believe in international. Whenever they lecture us about, human rights and international law and whatnot, it's not because they believe in it. It's because they think it's useful. It's to their interest to pursue that. And someone might say, well, the West does that as well. And I would counter that and say, no, that's not true, because the West does not actually get an advantage from screaming human rights, international law, human rights, because they can militarily dominate. And as they can militarily dominate, why do they need to scream these things, right? you know, they're just, they are tying their hands behind their back and fighting these people. And you guys are saying, well, no, it's just there's some there's some weird conspiracy plan that they have. No, they genuinely believe this. Yeah, of course they go above and beyond and do a bit too much sometimes, and of course there's some degree of hypocrisy. That's just people for you. But it's not the case that they don't believe in this stuff. They do. Well, they did. That's an important point. But let's carry on with the story. So, on the 7th of October 2023, something crazy happens. Hamas and their affiliates leave the Gaza Strip, invade southern Israel, kill a bunch of people, and take a bunch of hostages. This is an absolute war crime by international law, right? If you believe in human rights, you would condemn this. If you believe in international law, you would condemn this. You would say this is an atrocity, this was horrible, this was wrong. But something crazy happened in the West. You had protests, literally, on the 8th of October, condemning Israel, whilst there were still missiles being launched into Israel, whilst Israeli civilians were still being terrorized by a war of aggression waged by Hamas. You had protesters condemning Israel. And what was that about? And the honest answer is that if you ask these protesters, if you ask the supporters of Palestine, what was that about? And they will tell you. I mean, many of them will just outright tell you. They'll say, the Israelis deserved it. The Israelis are an occupying force. They are a colonial project, and they deserve it. They must be forced out of the land, and it's okay for the resistance to do this. So they're basically saying that the resistance doesn't have to follow international law. The resistance doesn't have to respect human rights. And the fact that these protests took place in the West is super interesting, because you've imported a bunch of people from different cultures who don't necessarily believe in the same human rights that you believe in. And not only that, but even in the school systems, you've not really pushed the Western narrative well. And this is a failure of the West, right? It's a real failure. So naturally, the war in Palestine and Israel continues, and obviously the Israelis are technologically and militarily superior to the people of Gaza. And, a lot of people are dead, right? There's been a high civilian cost to the Israeli operations. But nonetheless, the Israelis are not, at least not at the top level, rounding random civilians up and killing them. You can find examples of certain Israeli soldiers going beyond, and this is typical. These kind of things happen. But with even if you go off Hamas's figures, what is it, 60,000 dead, 60,000 compared to a population of, what was it, 2 point something million. It's laughable to call this a genocide. I mean, there's a high civilian cost, but it's not a genocide, technically speaking. I mean, you could try, but the key issue here is what ends up happening. What ends up happening is you have these international organizations that are meant to uphold international law and whatnot. They come after Israel, and this is a real issue. And the reason why it's a real issue is not because they're coming after Israel. It's not because the Israelis shouldn't be criticized if they do something wrong. They absolutely should. But the issue is, it's almost as if these institutions and whatnot are used as a means to constrain the power of Western powers. It's used to tie one hand of Western powers behind their back so that they can't fight properly. Whereas the enemies of the West, they have the freedom to do whatever it takes to secure victory. With a lot of these Islamic terror organizations, they hide their weapons in mosques, right? They hide behind civilians. They build their infrastructure underneath civilian buildings, and they say, "Well, you can't kill us now because you can't destroy the mosques. That's a war crime. You can't strike us whilst we're underneath this apartment complex because you're gonna kill a few hundred civilians. I mean, you can't do that. That's a war crime. It's technically not a war crime, but I don't think they realize that. But technically speaking, but they're using the ethics or the morality of these Western militaries against them. And by the way, that's not a bad strategy. It's not something I'm criticizing on a strategic level. I think it's a decent strategy, to be completely honest. But I think a lot of people are realizing what's actually at play here, and that's a problem for these groups, because if enough people in the West say, hey, these human rights, we might believe in them. Well, we might have believed in them, but they're not really sensible, because what you're saying is we shouldn't wage these wars where we can win, and we can win decisively. We shouldn't do that because, in the process, we're going to kill a bunch of civilians and whatnot, and, there might be a few violations and whatnot, and, the end result of us not doing that is our adversaries who don't even believe in these stuff and who have a worldview that's completely opposed to our own, are just going to be allowed to commit as many human rights abuses as they wish. I mean, Hamas can carry on throwing gay people off of buildings because, gosh, we can't go in and displace the Palestinians because that's ethnic cleansing, apparently. Really? I mean, you're telling me that we should condemn the safety and security of the whole world because, forcefully sterilizing these people is against human rights, even though the children they often abuse, and they raise them in a culture where they end up being a problem for us and our children. Really? I mean, that doesn't sound very good for us. Right? And that's what's happening. And when we look at the West right now, we have different groups emerging. We have, on the one hand, we have the people who support the resistance, and that's what they call it, the resistance. They support Hamas. I mean, they might not outright say it, but they support Hamas, and they don't believe in these human rights and whatnot. They don't really think that they matter. They don't really care about them. They're a growing group. I mean, they have politicians in the UK. They have politicians in Parliament. They run councils. They have money. Some of them have lots of money, right? They've done well for themselves, right? You have that group, and then you have another group who also doesn't believe in human rights. Remember, not everyone in the society has to believe in these things, but there's another group who doesn't believe in human rights, and they just don't like Muslims and brown people and whatnot. They just want to see a genocide. I mean, I'm being serious, by the way. This group exists as well, right? And they're upset. They're like, they support Israel not because Israel was attacked, not because of any love for Jewish people, but because they just want to see Palestinians die. That's their goal in life. And it's really odd because, like, what the frick did the Palestinians ever do to you? Like, the Palestinians did nothing, but some other brown person did something, and I just don't like brown people, right? They won't say that, but we know that's the case. So you have these two groups, and these groups are becoming stronger and stronger, right? Their narratives are becoming stronger and stronger. Now, if you are someone in the middle, someone who's not like, someone who, let's suppose you don't actually believe in human rights, but you're not really interested in Israeli benefit, and you're not really interested in Palestinian benefit. You don't really care. Let's say for the context here, let's say you're a British patriot. You're an actual patriot, not these weirdos online, but you're an actual patriot, and you think, I want to pursue British interests. I want to pursue the interests of my nation. In your back of your head, who do you think is is the side that should win this? Do you think it should be the side that supports a strategic ally of Britain, or should it be a side that supports a state that could be an ally, could not be an ally? We don't know. Judging off of the region, probably not the best ally. You know, who would you support in this if you had the option, right? And now, even if you're someone who believes in these human rights and whatnot, and you sit there and you see these two groups emerging, and you sit there and you think to yourself, you think, hold on a moment, right? If human rights are going to die anyways, which group would I prefer? A group that at least will be easier for us to pursue our national interests, or a group that, you know, doesn't really give a damn about our national interests and sees themselves as a fifth column, essentially? This is how I believe human rights will die, and they will be replaced. You might have civic rights, you might have rights for the citizen, but not rights for all humans. Even people on the left, they look around and they say, hey, hold on this moment, we're importing all these people, and we're saying, you know, they should be here, you know, they're oppressed, blah, blah, blah. But they come here and they perpetuate cultures which oppress women, you know, which are against the fundamental things we believe in. Why are we doing that? Why? You will see this, and I think that is the death of human rights, you know, as we know it. And, you know, to be fair, maybe it was always unsustainable, right? Maybe the rules which were made were just never feasible. Like the idea that you should never do a genocide, the idea that you should never, you know, engage in ethnic cleansing, the idea that you should never do these things. Maybe that was the wrong idea. I mean, maybe that's the case. And I know that sounds horrible for a lot of people, but, you know, gosh, look around. I mean, look around. Think about it. Like, think about it. Like, think about it. I mean, you have all these people who fundamentally do not believe in human rights. And for so many decades, they've been trying to argue using human rights to dissuade you from your interests. And if you listen to them, if you become dissuaded, what ends up happening is there's more human right violations, right? It's not the wars are not going to end because you say, well, we're not going to go the complete way, right? If you have an enemy or an adversary whose goal is to wipe you out, right? Their goal is to wipe you out. No amount of compromise is going to change that. Now, obviously, there is a concern in this as well, and the concern is, if you have a breakdown of human rights, do you also have a breakdown of the rights of the citizen, right? Because remember, some of the people who don't believe in human rights are also white nationalists, religious fundamentalists, right? Muslims, Christians, right? Even Jews in Israel, for example, there's Jews who have some really crazy ideas, right? And they go and build a settlement in the West Bank, and you know that's not good, right? So you know you have these religious fundamentalists, and it's crazy because you know I don't really see how this benefits the people who pushed for it, right? Like if you are Hamas, if you are Al-Qaeda, right? If you are Russia, if you are China, does this really serve your interests? Like, does it serve your interest that the West will no longer fight with one hand behind their back? I mean, maybe they're hoping, and this is maybe their hope, is that you can polarize the West so much that you can just have retards elected to power like we see in America with Trump, right? Oh gosh. That was my plan back in the day. But besides that, you know, that maybe that's their plan, but that plan, and this is important, that plan probably won't succeed. I mean, you might be able to take out some countries. Maybe you take out America. You know, maybe America becomes somewhat retarded and ruins a lot of its power. But does that benefit Russia, for example? You know, does Russia now get to take over Europe, which has the GDP that it can defend itself, right? It's just a question of will. Does it benefit? It might benefit China actually, but does do these things really benefit these countries? Like, it's one of the things is like the thing about it is, if you get rid of the constraints of people, their beliefs and their morality and whatnot, the society's morality. Obviously, individuals in the society will always have differing opinions, but the ruling, the decision making morality, you know, if you're on the side of the adversary, if you're the adversary, it might not make sense because you don't want your enemy to go all out in total war. That's not what you want, right? Especially if they have the ability to wipe you out, right? Oh gosh, that's not what you want. Like, I mean, I don't know, and one of the big issues I think which is going to happen, and I genuinely believe this. I believe that the Palestinian cause has caused this, and I believe the Palestinians' cause will never succeed. I genuinely believe that because I look, the Israelis can inflict a real genocide if they want to. They can do it. What constrains them is their own morality, because Israelis protest against the Israeli government like every 5 minutes, right? There's a lot of Israeli society is very polarized always. There's their own morality, and after their own morality, it's the morality of the West. The Americans won't approve of it, the British won't approve of it, Europe won't approve of it. But if the Israelis can convince their own society that actually we have to do this, we have to wage this terrible, horrible war, and we have to accept massive civilian casualties. We have to keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And then if the West no longer has their own concern about rules of war and human rights and whatnot, what do they care? I mean, this is their strategic ally. Do what you want. I mean, it might be a problem if it annoys the Arab states, right? It might be a problem if it annoys the United Arab Emirates. It might be a problem if it annoys Saudi Arabia. It might be a problem if it annoys these countries. But, actually, these countries don't believe in the human rights shit anyways. They don't care either. Why do you think the UAE and Israel are best friends? What do you think that's about? The leadership in these countries don't care either, right? I mean, the populations, they care, but they care. They don't care based on human rights. They care mainly based on the idea that these are people who are dying. These are people who are like us who are being victimized. Therefore, blah blah blah. But the rulership in a lot of these countries are somewhat sensible. They're not that crazy about our people or come on, that's not how they think. And so I don't know. I mean, would it really annoy the other partners of the West? Would it really annoy them? Would it? Maybe it wouldn't. I mean, and that's the only constraint. If we're going to have that's the only constraint. The only constraint is that, we don't want to annoy the other countries in the region. Then the question is, well, okay, but for how long will we be hostage to annoying them? Are these partners real partners, or are they not real partners? Could we just take it over, colonize it, engage in a real genocide and just civilize it? And this type of language is how people used to talk during the colonial period. They used to, we're going to civilize these lands. We have to go and do these things. And that's what we're looking at. And it's not going to be a good future for the Palestinians. It's not going to be a good future for the people of that region. Turkey might have its own opinions on that, but Turkey just wants to, increase its sphere of influence. So, I don't know if that's something, because people forget the Arabs in the region, they rebelled against it, the Ottomans. They don't like being ruled by the Turks, right? So what is it? Want to be ruled by the Jews or want to be ruled by the Turks? If that's your two options, gosh, your movement failed.